Greetings and welcome to the VolitionRx Webcast. It is now my pleasure to introduce your host, Scott Powell, Head of Investor Relations and U.S. CFO. Thank you, Mr. Powell. You may begin.
Thank you, Doug. And welcome, everyone, to the VolitionRx Limited investor presentation. Hope you're all doing well in these different and challenging times. Thank you very much for joining me today to hear a bit more about the Volition story, and for those of you who are familiar, to get an update on some of our current developments and upcoming milestones throughout the course of 2020 and 2021. So again, we're VolitionRx Limited, ticker VNRX on the NYSE American Stock Exchange. And I point you to this slide. I will be making some forward-looking statements during this presentation. This slide, easy to read. Our mission is simple. We want to save lives. What is Volition doing? We are a diagnostics company, and we're developing blood tests primarily to screen for different cancer types. And I'll explain a bit more about this mission when we get to a slide a little bit later in the presentation. Which is here. This is a quote from the American Cancer Society. And it's the screening increases the chances of finding certain cancers early when they are most likely to be curable. So screening is critical to finding various cancer types early, and it's critical to improving outcomes because, as this quote says, if you can diagnose cancer early, your chances of surviving or surviving longer than if you found the cancer at a late stage increase substantially. So if we look at the next slide, we can see currently how most cancers are currently screened. You can see that that blood is not commonly used to screen for most cancer types. If you look on the left, you'll see that blood testing is used for many other diseases: diabetes, cardiovascular function, kidney function, thyroid, liver function, reproductive function, infectious disease, and inflammatory disease. All of those diseases are screened for, or bodily functions are screened for, through blood tests. But if you look on the right, you'll see most cancer types are not screened currently via a blood-based modality. They're screened through x-rays, mammography, MRI scan, CAT scan, biopsy, colonoscopy, a flex-sig, fecal test, or a pap smear. Really, there's only one cancer type that is screened currently through a blood test, and that's the PSA test for prostate cancer in men, of course. It's really the only blood test that's administered on a regular basis as a frontline blood test, as a frontline screening test for any cancer type. It's not for lack of wanting blood tests. It's just that historically, blood tests have historically in the laboratory failed to demonstrate the efficacy or accuracy needed for the FDA or for other regulatory bodies globally to approve them as frontline screens for various cancer types. So there are blood tests out there that are used unofficially as screens for cancer types, but they're not recommended by the FDA, although some of them are used kind of off-label. You have CA 19-9, CA125, and various other blood tests. We hope to change that. We hope that Volition is able to demonstrate stronger efficacy, more accuracy, i.e. lower false negative rates and lower false positive rates than other blood tests that have tried to make it into the marketplace as frontline screens for various cancer types. So we're hoping to move a variety of blood tests for different cancer types into the marketplace over the coming years. And we're currently in clinical studies that we're conducting all over the globe to show just how accurate or efficacious our blood test for various cancer types is. So if we take our first cancer type that we've been running clinical studies on for many years, which is colorectal cancer, we can look at that particular cancer type. Let me also just mention that if you look at the slide on the right and you see the various diagnostic tests that are run for most cancer types, you'll see that a lot of these suffer from limitations. So some of them, particularly the scans here, expose the patient to radiation, which could actually cause cancer because of the radiation from the x-rays and the scans. Other tests here are invasive. A biopsy, by definition, is an invasive surgical procedure, not without risk of infection, internal bleeding. And for lung cancer biopsy, about 15 to 20% of the time, a lung cancer biopsy, when they go in to get a tissue sample, causes a collapsed lung. Many of these screens here are very expensive, hundreds or thousands of dollars for some of these tests. Many of these tests are good for late-stage detection and not as good for early-stage detection. And obviously, we saw from the last slide, that's the inverse of where a clinician or a patient wants to be in terms of cancer detection. You want to be finding cancer at the early stages rather than the late stages, of course. Some of these tests are invasive. Think of colonoscopy, a very invasive procedure, a very expensive procedure, and a procedure that many people really don't look forward to for obvious reasons. So a lot of these screens suffer from a variety of limitations. Blood-based tests don't necessarily suffer from a lot of these limitations. Blood test really can't harm a patient. If you're extracting a certain amount of blood from a patient and running that blood through laboratory equipment, you can't harm a patient once the blood has been taken. And so many people prefer blood tests over other types of screens because we've been accustomed to giving blood, most of us many, many times over the course of our lives for routine physicals, for routine blood work, etc. So if we look at our first cancer type that we have been running clinical studies on for many years, you'll see some of the limitations here. If we go to the next slide. So this slide is in regard to colorectal cancer. That's the cancer type that we've been focused on for many years. If you look at the statistics, they're pretty alarming. 1/3 of eligible adults in the United States have never been screened for colorectal cancer. The U.S. Preventative Services Task Force recommends that colorectal cancer screening can save lives. A very interesting statistic, if colorectal cancer is diagnosed in stage 1, the patient has a 95% chance of surviving more than 5 years. If a person is diagnosed with colorectal cancer at stage 4, 90% of those individuals are dead in 5 years. So colorectal cancer, like most cancer types, is very treatable if it's found in the early stages and not very treatable and with very poor outcomes if colorectal cancer is found in the late stage. So you can see the title of this slide is the compliance problem, and that's the problem we have currently with colorectal cancer screening. We actually have a very accurate test. The colonoscopy is the primary screen in the United States. Outside the U.S., countries tend to screen with cheaper fecal tests, the FIT or fecal immunochemical test, or the FOBT, the fecal occult blood test. But in the U.S., we recommend a colonoscopy as the frontline screen because it's a very accurate test. However, very expensive. It's invasive by definition. There's an unpleasant prep procedure prior to undergoing the colonoscopy procedure. A colonoscopy can cost $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, $10,000, depending on the state in which you're having the procedure done in the hospital or the lab. And so because of the cost, because it's a day to 2 days where you can't really work because you're doing the prep work, you're having the procedure done, you're being administered local or general anesthesia, you can't drive yourself to or from the procedure, for those reasons, compliance rates sit at around 62% in the U.S. and tend to be much lower in other parts of the world. So it's not that we lack a good test for colorectal cancer, it's the compliance problem. People really just don't like the options available to them. A colonoscopy for the reasons I just mentioned, and fecal tests, although do not have inherent risk because it's simply analyzing, looking for microscopic traces of blood and stool. Fecal tests are generally self-administered tests, and therefore they're unpleasant, and they also suffer from compliance issues. We think a blood test largely solves the compliance problem because while a person may delay, or refuse a colonoscopy, that same person probably wouldn't refuse a blood test if there were one available for him or her to take, particularly if that person could take the blood test while he or she is going in for his annual physical and all the associated blood work that is typically done when you go in for your annual physical. So in other words, if you're going in for your annual physical and going down the street to Quest or LabCorp or your local lab and having 10 or 15 or 20 different blood tests run and you're giving 3 or 4 or 5 vials of blood, the doctor can just tick another box at the bottom of the requisition form, order a Volition blood test for colorectal cancer screening, and get you screened. A very simple, seamless routine procedure. In the U.S., there are over 100 million Americans now of screening age. The American Cancer Society dropped the screening age in the U.S. from age 50 down to age 45. So now the screening age demographic is ages 45 to 75 in the U.S., well over 100 million Americans of screening age. In Europe, about 150 million Europeans of screening age. Compliance rates in Europe are at about 50% in aggregate. So that's roughly 75 million Europeans who are not current with their screening, and compliance rates at about 62% in the U.S. It's about 40 million Americans who are not compliant with their screening for colorectal cancer. Many of those Americans would likely say yes to a simple blood test while saying no to a colonoscopy or a fecal test. So I think the market is clear. We're looking to charge somewhere in the $200 to $500 range for our blood test for colorectal cancer. Our cost of goods is sub $10 US, so we have a very healthy gross profit margin. Even if we're doing a licensing or a partnering deal with, say, a Quest or a LabCorp or someone like that in the U.S., we would still have a very healthy gross profit margin. We just have to show that the test is accurate. So I'll point you to another slide here that documents some of our clinical results. So you can see in lung, colorectal, and we've also conducted one study in blood-borne cancers. We're showing areas under the curve in 70s, 80s, and 90 percentiles. What that means is where we're getting false negative rates, sensitivity in 80, 90% range. That means about 10 to 20% false negatives. And we're getting specificity in the 80 to 90% range. Again, about 10 to 20% false positives. Obviously, you want to reduce the number of false negatives and false positives in your test, but all tests, by definition, have a certain number of false negatives and a certain number of false positives. I don't believe there's any test that's 100% accurate. That is, no false negatives and no false positives. A false negative is simply a test that says a person doesn't have a particular disease, but upon further investigation, it turns out that person did indeed have that particular disease, and a false positive is really the opposite. The test tells you that you have a particular disease state, and upon further investigation, it turns out you don't. So you obviously want to minimize both of those. And depends on the country. Some countries value lower false negatives and will tolerate higher false positives, and others are the opposite, and some really want low numbers of each. It really depends on the cancer type, and it depends on the country. I think we're down to about 6 or 7 minutes left, so I'll move off of colorectal cancer and talk a bit about lung cancer. With colorectal cancer, we would like to position our product as a frontline screen, as the first test that a person takes for colorectal cancer screening. And then if a person tests positive from our blood test for colorectal cancer, he or she would then have to go on for, would be recommended to go on for a colonoscopy procedure, which is the definitive diagnostic. With lung cancer, there's a different challenge with lung cancer, and we wouldn't look to be a frontline blood test for lung cancer. That is the first test a person took. Rather, we would go for a 510K pathway with intended use as an adjunct or a companion screen. Currently, a lot of lung cancer screens, and I know this because my father's in the hospital currently and just had a lung cancer screen yesterday, but many lung cancer screens are done through a CAT scan, and that's an image of your lungs that the doctor then has to interpret. And the issue that the doctors often have is they have a hard time evaluating whether or not a lesion or a nodule or something suspicious that they see on the CT scan, whether or not they think that warrants further investigation, which, as I mentioned earlier, is often a lung biopsy, and as I mentioned earlier, causes a collapsed lung about 15 to 20% of the time. So doctors can be somewhat wary of having a patient proceed on to a lung biopsy because of risk of infection or a collapsed lung and other complications. So if the doctor could then run a blood test in addition to the CAT scan as a second piece of information to give the doctor more confidence that this is something suspicious, or more confidence that this really isn't anything to worry about, and let's monitor the patient. So it could be a second confirmatory test. So if the doctor sees something suspicious on the CAT scan, he or she could run a Volition blood test, and if the blood test comes back positive, then the doctor feels a lot more comfortable sending that patient on for a lung biopsy or other more invasive diagnostic testing. So it could be a very valuable tool. And we're looking at working on the two deadliest cancers. Lung cancer, and I think every country globally, is the deadliest cancer type. And colorectal cancer in most countries is the second leading cause of cancer-related death. So we're looking at two of the deadliest cancer types. That's where we would fit in with lung cancer as an adjunct test. We have clinical studies in both colorectal cancer underway in Europe at the University of Copenhagen, studies underway at National Taiwan University in Taipei, Taiwan, and in lung cancer we have two studies underway also at National Taiwan University in Taipei, Taiwan. So we expect some initial data from these three studies. We also have a study in colorectal cancer at National Taiwan University. So we expect initial data from the Copenhagen studies sometime this year, and from the in colorectal cancer, and National Taiwan studies in colorectal and lung also sometime this year. And because we're getting down to just a few minutes, I'd like to focus lastly on our first animal health product, which is a blood test that we're developing to screen for cancer in canines or dogs. We formed a wholly owned subsidiary called Volition Veterinary Diagnostics Development, LLC. We granted 12.5% equity ownership of this wholly owned subsidiary to Texas A&M University in College Station, Texas. Texas A&M University is running a number of clinical studies for us currently on canines to see if we can detect cancer in dogs. You can see the statistics: 25% of dogs will develop cancer at some stage of their lives. 4.2 million canines are diagnosed annually in the U.S. compared to 1.7 million humans, and our pricing can be somewhat comparable to our blood tests for human health. A&M's telling us about $100 to $200 per test. So this is an important year as we process some of the samples. We report clinical study results. If the results are strong in diagnosing cancer in dogs, we're taking a couple different approaches. We're looking at what's the most common cancer across all breeds of dogs to see if we can diagnose the one or two most common cancers. And then we're looking at breed specific. We're hearing a lot of evidence from the Veterinary College of Medicine at Texas A&M that certain breeds of dogs are predisposed to certain cancer types. They really only get one particular cancer type, according to a lot of the veterinarians and the research done at Texas A&M. So we're looking at can we develop cancer tests to look for the most common cancers across all breeds of dogs, and then we can also look at some breed-specific cancer tests to see if we can hone in on some of the more popular or commonly common breeds of dogs. So we're looking to announce results from A&M sometime this year. If the results are strong, we would work with Texas A&M to register our blood tests with the USDA, the Department of Agriculture. We don't have to go through the FDA because it's an animal health product. And then if and when we have the product registered with the USDA, we would then look to launch the product nationwide in the U.S. So really a lot of opportunities here between lung cancer, colorectal cancer, and our veterinary work. And I'll just wrap up before turning it over to any questions that we might have. We have a slide here on our financials. So again, you can see our ticker is VNRX on the NYSE American. Market cap's around 115 million. We're burning about 1.2 million per month. Cash on hand at the end of December 2019 was 17 million. Strong insider ownership. Insiders own about 20-25% of the company. Institutions have about 20%. And we have 4 analysts that currently cover the company. So I will poll for any questions and try and wrap up in the next minute or two so the next presenters can come on board. Any questions? I think the operator has instructed the listeners on how to submit questions. I don't see any currently, but let me refresh. Okay, someone has a question. How has the company been affected by the COVID pandemic? Good question. So far, we haven't seen any major negative impact from COVID-19. Our Belgian laboratory is operating close to full capacity. We are employing, social distancing at the lab. A lot of the scientists are working independently anyway. Our clinical studies, the timelines really haven't been impacted significantly. Our studies are in China, Taiwan, and Belgium, and Texas A&M. The researchers at Texas A&M are still actually going into the lab at A&M and processing samples. It's a lot quieter there because there are no students at Texas A&M, so things are actually moving along quite well. And a lot of investors have been asking me, are we trying to develop a blood test that could potentially detect the coronavirus? And I answer investors is that we have some indication that our technology may have some application, that we may be able to detect the virus. We are looking internally to see if that's the case. And certainly if we have any positive results to announce, we'll announce them in due course. And if we don't, of course, we won't announce anything as it relates to that. But so far, so good. We haven't been negatively impacted by the pandemic, and we're in a reasonably strong cash position, so we can weather the storm, if you will, and let the Dow recover as it's already begun to. So thank you for that. I'll refresh to see if there's any other questions. Operator, if I still have a minute, I could answer this last question. What do you see as the next commercial milestones investors should be looking for? The commercial milestones, I would say it's more clinical milestones this year and commercial milestones next year. So clinical milestones this year would be clinical data from lung and colorectal at National Taiwan University, clinical data from colorectal at the University of Copenhagen, clinical data in our animal health blood tests from Texas A&M University. If we have any positive data as it relates to coronavirus testing, we would announce that in due course this year. And next year, we would look to bring these products into the commercial market. So we'd look to commercialize blood tests for lung and colorectal cancer from Taiwan. We've announced publicly that we're working with Fosun out of Shanghai to potentially launch blood tests in the China market. And we've been working with the University of Copenhagen for many years. So ideally, we'll be able to launch products in China, Taiwan, and Europe sometime next year if timelines hold. And also, we would hope to be able to launch our vet product in the U.S. perhaps as early as next year. So a lot of interesting things really happening. A lot of clinical data this year and a lot of hopefully commercial progress next year. Operator, do I have time for another question, or do we need to cut it off here?
I'm sorry, we're running short of time now, Mr. Powell.
Okay. Great. Well, thanks, Doug. I'll turn it back over to you, and thank you, everyone, for listening to the VolitionRx presentation this afternoon. Appreciate it, and hopefully you'll keep following our developments and news flow.
Ladies and gentlemen, this does conclude today's teleconference. You may disconnect your lines at this time, and have a wonderful day.